Okay, welcome everyone. We hope you're all doing really well, no matter what state you're in. Today, we are going to have a quick discussion about ASQA's regulatory strategy for the next couple of years, which was released a few weeks ago, and particularly with a focus today on the online learning compliance, because that's obviously a huge part of people's focus of recently. In fact, ASQA actually stated that over 1,000 RTOs have formally notified them in 2020 with a move to online. So first of all, before we start, I'd just like to thank Accelerate for hosting this morning's webinar. My name is Chris Enright, and I'll be your presenter for the next 30 to 40 minutes. Okay, so today we are focusing on three main areas. A quick look at the regulatory strategy that was released a short while ago. A bit of a focus on online learning compliance. And then we'll have a quick look at some course design tips as well if we're providers that are moving across from traditional face-to-face delivery and assessment methods into the online environment, or those who are just looking to create fully online programs. So the regulatory strategy identifies a couple of key focal points and a couple of key areas that they would like to improve on. It does mention this provider risk versus systematic risk in the document, and I just wanted to clarify for people what that actually means. So when ASQA refers to provider risk, it's talking about risks that are associated with providers, so provider behavior, and it's typically isolated to one or a few providers. When we talk about systematic risk, we are talking about more industry-wide risks that might be associated with a particular policy change, for example, or changing industry practices. ASQA has committed, and I'm sure many of you will probably be saying that we've heard this all before, but the regulator has committed to working with providers more closely in a collaborative manner. So that's evident in the creation of working committees. There's an effort to conduct stronger industry engagement as well. There's targeted communications for the industry, so you will have noticed an increase in the level of information that's been made publicly available to providers through the ASQA website and their newsletter, and also making that information more accessible for providers. There is an absolute understanding of the impacts providers are facing with COVID, and there is a large effort on the regulator's behalf to ensure that providers are supported through this period, and concessions have been made in some cases, or more information has been provided to providers to support them through that. So the key focus points identified in this strategy for the next couple of years are online learning, obviously, and vet and schools, and they're the two main focal points. I'm just going to remove my webcam because being in lockdown Melbourne without access to hairdressers, I don't think people want to look at my hair. So I'll just take that off. So let's have a quick look at vet and schools first, and then the rest of the webinar will be primarily focusing on that online learning focus point. So vet and schools, for the providers out there that do participate in these programs, vet and schools is the delivery of accredited training in the secondary school system, and it is considered extremely high risk from the regulator's point of view. The regulator has concerns around the quality of delivery, the outcomes, the industry relevance, and the employee engagement, and then also major concerns around trainer assessor quality, availability of resources to meet the package requirements, and also the provision of information to prospective learners. So you can imagine in your RTO, when a prospective learner inquires about a particular program, you're in a position to provide them with detailed information about how you run that program, what student services are available to support them through the program, etc. When you have an auspicing arrangement or third-party arrangement where a school, a secondary school, is taking on that responsibility of providing that information, providing quality trainers and assessors, providing the resources and the learning resources and the learning environment, it takes away a lot of control from the RTO. But it's really important to note here that the RTO maintains full accountability. So vet and schools providers need to ensure that they've got extremely rigorous processes for onboarding new schools, educating schools on the obligations under the regulator, and also ensuring that the trainers and assessors, the resources are available, and that students understand what they're getting into when they enroll into one of these programs. So that is a huge focal point for ASQA over the next couple of years. So if you are a vet and schools provider, then we would strongly recommend that you look to review, if you haven't already, review your processes for onboarding in particular, and also the processes for how you ensure quality of training and assessment as well. The regulatory strategy also outlines a couple of strategic initiatives, and some of these will look really familiar because they were focal points of the previous regulatory strategy. So things that we're used to here: trainer and assessor capabilities. The TAE, training products, is an ongoing concern to the regulator, and also provision of education and guidance on the regulator's behalf. If we take a look at the clauses that were of major concern to the provider, or clauses that the regulator has identified as key non-compliance areas, you can see here that the majority of these actually centre around training and assessment strategies and resources. So 1.8, 1.3, 1.2, 1.1, there is going to be a huge focus on quality of delivery and assessment, obviously. Seeing these as being identified as the common areas of non-compliance in previous years, and then taking that into consideration with the fact that so many providers are moving very quickly to change the way that they engage with learners, typically into an online environment. That in combination with these clauses of concerns speaks for itself and really justifies why ASQA is focusing on online learning. So today what we're going to do is talk briefly about the strategies that we can put in place to ensure that we are delivering the best program that's suited for an online environment. And finally, one other area of focus is engagement with industry, and industry being the vet sector. So ASQA wants to be able to provide greater guidance to providers. It wants to engage and collaborate with providers. And we can see that there's a lot of work happening in the background there with webinars and video discussions. They've scheduled in provider briefings across the year, monthly newsletters, the info line, etc. So they are making a conscious effort to engage and build that collaborative relationship with the industry. So let's take a look at this main focal point, which is online learning. And before we do that, I just wanted to define online learning, because there are different definitions out there, and people have a different perspective of what would constitute online learning. So if we take the regulator's definition, it's where training is delivered predominantly online. Okay, and if we look at the definition of online learning today versus online learning, say 5 years ago, it's very different as well. So in the current world, we have the ability to easily implement virtual classrooms. It's about delivery that typically occurs via a platform, an LMS, a learning management system, and they define synchronous and asynchronous models. So synchronous models being where a trainer and a student can meet in the same environment, whether that's through a platform or a virtual classroom, live. And that's very different to asynchronous, which is more of a self-paced model. So there's a big difference between a student jumping into a virtual classroom and engaging online with a trainer versus a student who might be working on self-paced e-learning modules after hours once they've come home from work. They typically define fully online, so courses that are defined as fully online would have 80% or more of the course conducted in an online environment. So that would probably include, to a large degree, assessments where possible, and we will talk about the way that we develop assessments for the online environment, particularly when we've got training packages that do have practical requirements as part of the assessment requirements. And just a quick note there to say that PDFs are not necessarily online learning. So in a mad rush to continue engaging with our cohorts under the circumstances, a lot of providers have pushed out PDFs or fillable PDFs. And what we're talking about here is something a little more complex than that, say. So we're talking about a purpose-built learning management system that has the ability for both learner and trainer to engage through that medium, and the learner can then engage in interactive content. Some of the challenges that providers face with online learning is obviously keeping students engaged. And I think we'll talk about this shortly about cohorts, but it takes a certain type of student to be able to work their way through a self-paced online program, and it's not necessarily for everyone. Digital capabilities of your support team is also another challenge, and this includes trainers and assessors. And we will talk about this briefly as well. The cohort capabilities, so as I mentioned, the ability for students to be motivated and to ensure that they are continually engaged in that content, is really important. And then also probably the most challenging component, in my opinion, is finding or building those resources that actually engage students online. So there's a big difference between an online resource and an online resource that's interactive and engaging. And that's extremely important. I had some conversations with some learning design professionals and some other consultants over the last couple of weeks, and we came up with these ingredients for successful online content or online learning. And the first one was to have clear expectations. So that's defining those expectations to the learner before they enroll in the program. And this feeds back into Chapter 1 of the standards, which talks about the provision of accurate and accessible information to prospective learners. It's really important that we're transparent and upfront with students about what they're getting involved in. The second ingredient there was learner support. For an online program to work and for a student to continually engage with that content and progress through that program, it's really important that we have defined and accessible learner support mechanisms. The third one was good content, and that goes without saying. A well-designed piece of content that is engaging makes all the difference in this environment. So again, sending out the PDFs or having readable PDFs is great, but if it's not engaging and students don't find it interesting or fun, then the chances are that our programs will suffer from major withdrawal rates and poor completion rates. We need to have, as an RTO, great systems. So we need to have a purpose-built learning management system that can engage with learners in the right forum. And some of you will already have those systems in place. There are student management systems that also act as learning management systems as well. And I think it's really important that we have the right platform to engage with our learners. And finally, regular reporting. And this is often something that's missed by providers, is the ability to run internal reports off your student management system or learning management system to track student engagement. Because the minute a student drops off their engagement, we need to be on top of them reaching out to them through an email or a phone call and offering support if they need it. So let's take a look at that first ingredient, which was clear expectations. And this goes back to the marketing and recruitment component, which is chapter 1 of the user guides. So making sure that learners make an informed decision and are aware of the course delivery, how the assessments will be conducted, because they may be participating in online content or online delivery, but there may still need to be a requirement for them to participate in face-to-face assessments. We need to make sure that they have an acceptable level of digital literacy. They need to have access to reliable internet. They need to have perhaps specific download requirements or internet speeds. And they need to know what they have to provide themselves. So if they participate or if they enroll in a program, do they have to provide their own computer? They need to be aware of that if that's the case. And they also need to be aware of the support mechanisms that are in place for online. So taking the student through that enrolment journey, pre-enrollment reviews that we conduct should identify the additional support needs, and that includes LLN, digital literacy, and other required resources or support. And I think state-funded training providers are in a unique position because those state funding contracts are quite heavily regulated, and they explicitly prescribe pre-training reviews or pre-enrollment reviews as part of those contracts. So I think that the organisations out there that are listening today that are funded at a state level would probably already have a lot of these in place. It gets a little bit weaker or a little bit broader when we get into pure fee-for-service organisations, and quite often organisations miss this critical part of the enrolment process. And importantly, we need to onboard our students in our new systems. And this is not just for new students, this is for existing students that may have enrolled in a face-to-face program who we are now telling have to engage in our content online. So it's really important that we offer an onboarding process and a support mechanism for students. So that would include educating students on how to access materials off an LMS, how to access and submit assessments, what the expected turnaround times are for assessments, how to contact their trainer or assessor if they need help, and how to escalate concerns. I had a conversation with a student the other day. They're participating in an engineering program down at their local provider, and they have not heard from their provider since February this year. Now they are enrolled in a funded program, and they haven't received a single email, a single phone call, absolutely no engagement, yet they're still enrolled in the program. So that's not a great example, because that particular person has basically thrown in the towel with their program. And it's really important that we engage with our learners on a regular basis. And we'll talk about how we can build reports to feed in and prompt our staff to make contact with our students. When we look at our training and assessment strategies, we need to really make sure that we're defining our target cohort. Need to document those entry requirements, particularly for those online courses. The amount of training becomes extremely important to begin with, but becomes even more pertinent when we're delivering online. Our trainer capabilities need to be addressed, and our support mechanisms need to be well documented and clearly articulated to the learner. So let's have a look at those target cohorts. So the learner cohort, when we sit down and identify that learner cohort in a TAS, we need to outline what that learner cohort's digital capabilities look like. And this will feed into entry requirements as well for the program. There needs to be some acceptable level of technological capability in order to successfully access those resources and engage with that content. Our learners need to have access to relevant resources. So as I mentioned before, internet speeds and download limits, required hardware or software. So if your program requires the installation of certain software, that needs to be articulated to prospective learners before they enroll. We need to make sure that the learners that we are targeting are self-motivated and have positive attitudes when it comes to self-paced study, and that's really important. This is not for everyone, and that's really important to note. Online learning does not work for all cohorts in the vet sector, and it's really important that our cohorts are motivated, because otherwise we will suffer at the hands of poor completion rates. And it might be worth also in exploring what our cohort's work-study relationship looks like. So are we pitching a program to full-time workers that are not going to be able to look at this content or engage in this content until after hours? And if so, what does that look like if we try to implement a synchronous model where trainers engage with students in live virtual classrooms? If they're not available during business hours, that changes the way that we potentially structure our operations. So it's really important that we understand the lifestyle and the motivators of our cohorts. And then once we've established that understanding, we can then go and build a program that's suitable for those learners. When we talk about amount of training and the fact that amount of training must meet the training package requirements, it must also take into consideration the skills, knowledge, and experience of the learner cohort. So if we go back to that previous slide, exploring what that learner profile looks like and understanding what their life is like and when they're going to be studying and engaging with content will help us better understand the skills, knowledge, and experience of that cohort. Learners also need time to absorb information and process what they have learned. And this is critical in any vet program, but more so with online learning. If you've got online content that can be easily navigated through, so an old scroll and click mentality, then we're not forcing learners to take the time to absorb that information and process their learnings. So we may look at strategies such as controlling the access to assessments or controlling the access to the next module as a way of enforcing this. So for example, if a learner consumes a bit of content, we might prevent them from accessing the next module for 2 days so that they have time to absorb that information. And then we might implement some activities in that content to test their knowledge and skills. Trainer capabilities are critical. So if we look at the organizations that are moving from traditional face-to-face delivery models into online environments, a lot of those trainers will not be comfortable with the face-to-face delivery. A lot of these trainers will be pushed outside of their comfort zone to engage with learners on online platforms. And they are a critical component to the success of a learner's experience. We need those trainers to be well versed in our systems because they will essentially be offering that support to our learners. So we'd recommend organizations look at implementing a strong PD program, professional development program, to support their trainers and upskill their trainers in the relevant areas. A lot of providers did this really successfully back in early March, April this year, where they actually ran induction programs for their training teams on how to utilize Zoom, how to utilize their learning management systems, and made sure that those trainers were experienced and comfortable with those platforms before they rolled them out to students. We also need to critically make sure that trainers understand how to collect and store evidence online. So we do need to store our assessment evidence, for example, for at least 6 months after the date that that assessment has been deemed competent or satisfactory. So we want to make sure that we have a strong record keeping process for that online environment. Learner support is, as I mentioned, a critical part of the success of an online program. So need to make it easy for students to be able to access help and talk to their trainer. And this is really important. It goes back to that story I mentioned earlier about the student who hadn't heard from their provider since February this year. Their particular learning management system does not have a mechanism for communicating directly with the trainer, and it's very difficult for them to find out how they can talk to that person directly. And again, this goes back to our pre-enrollment or our enrollment process, where we onboard a student into our systems. We need to make sure that our students are very comfortable with being able to just put their hand up in that virtual world and say, I need some help. So a lot of these learning management platforms will have the ability to email the trainer directly, or they'll have some kind of chat room. And it's also important that we have trainers understanding that they need to respond to those requests in a timely fashion. Leaving a call for help from a student for 14 days is not good enough. So we'd recommend things like regular check-ins with students, one-on-one phone calls or virtual meetings. If you're running a synchronous model where you've got regularly scheduled Zoom sessions or virtual sessions, that's a fantastic way to engage with students. If that's not the case and the program is typically self-paced, then we want to make sure that we still have trainers, assessors reaching out to those learners on a regular basis. The reporting is critical in this aspect. So if you've got a student management system or learning management system that has the capability to report on student engagement, so for example, the platform might be able to report on all of the students who have not logged into a platform in the last 14 days. That's a great example of a very simple report that you can run. And then those students might be identified as medium or high risk. And then you can work through that list and call those students or email them to offer them support. And that act of reaching out could be the difference between those learners continuing and getting back on that train versus dropping off and withdrawing from the program. We need to make sure that we have those processes to react accordingly. So when we build those reports and we flag or identify those learners that need assistance or have dropped off, what do we do? Who's responsible? And how do we communicate with those learners? Conducting assessment is probably a webinar in itself, and I think I'm not going to do that justice today. But what I would like to say about the assessment process is, obviously this is specific to the training product that you're delivering. So some units of competency will have very explicit assessment conditions, and quite often people participating in online learning will still have to participate in face-to-face assessments. At a minimum, we need to be able to provide an easy-to-use platform for students to access assessments. They need to understand how to submit assessments. We need to articulate what the expected turnaround times are on assessment. So if we have centralized assessors assessing the work and sending feedback to the students, what does that look like from the student's experience? Should they be waiting 1 or 2 days for a response? Or will they have to wait up to 2 weeks for their results to come back? We also want to ensure that assessment practices meet the principles of assessment for that online environment. So you need to ask yourself questions like, how do you know that the student is submitting their own work? And learning management systems will have IP address tracking and audit trails that document login times, etc. But another great question is, how do you observe practical skills? And for those training products that have units of competency that have explicit assessment tasks or assessment conditions, that's just not possible in an online environment for a lot of those units of competency. And so there are strategies that you can implement. There are providers out there at the moment who are assessing practical skills demonstration through videos. So students or learners are going into the workplace and recording themselves perform certain tasks, and then they're submitting that as evidence, and assessors are watching those videos and passing that assessment. And ASQA has produced some additional guidance on that. We also want to make sure, as I mentioned before, that we store that evidence for at least 6 months. Like I said, I think this is probably another 40-minute conversation on its own, and I certainly won't be doing it justice today. When we look at course design, before we create online content, we need to ask a couple of questions. So we talked about the cohort before, but who is our cohort? What time of day will they be studying? What competing priorities do they have? We need to understand how people and when people are going to engage with our content in order to create the most engaging content. And how will learners engage with that content online? Is our current system easy to use? Or do we need to go out and implement a new learning management system? How easy is it for students to access live support? If our target cohorts are working full-time and they can only study on weekends or at nights, how do they access live support? Is that possible? We need to start thinking about the resourcing in our organisation. Do we need to employ people to provide support after hours for these learners? And whatever we decide to do at an operational level needs to be reflected in the communication pre-enrollment as well. And then finally, how do we make that content engaging and fun? There is nothing worse than logging into a platform and seeing paragraph after paragraph of text. We might as well just have a PDF document printed out and mailed to our house. So some things to consider when we're building online content. Invest in graphics. Graphics are engaging. High quality images, high quality videos that are small and short are really important to the success of any program. Pre-recordings of trainers is usually not the most engaging content. And this is a question that comes up more frequently than not. I get a lot of clients asking us, how do we record our trainers delivering our programs so that we can put them online? And I couldn't think of anything worse than asking a student to sit through 2 to 4 hours of pre-recorded content in a single or 2 sittings. We always recommend that if you are going to pre-record trainers, that you make sure that that trainer is articulate and good on a camera, or good in terms of presentation skills. And we also recommend that you break down that content into maximum 10 to 15 minute blocks. So if they're going to pre-record an hour of talking, then we would expect to see 5 or 6 different videos that are embedded throughout that content. Otherwise, people are just simply not going to listen to it. And we really want to make sure we break that content down into bite-sized chunks. So if the course is too heavy, learners will become overwhelmed and they will drop off. Small milestones, such as lessons or modules, provide encouragement and a sense of progression. And that's extremely important. I will show you an example of that where a course has potentially been broken down into individual modules. So you can see here for a first aid program, this is online content that has been developed for an LMS. And we've broken down that content into individual lessons here. And as the student progresses through the content, it actually tracks their progress as well. And so this is what we mean by breaking down the content into small milestones. So that if the learner leaves this page and goes and makes some dinner and then comes back and logs back in, it will remember where they left off and they can continue on from there. And you can see this content has high quality graphics. It has a little bit of text here, but not too much. And there are different ways that we can present that information. So if you think of these flashcards, the alternative might be that we just have a paragraph of text that talks about the different signs and symptoms of anaphylaxis. But instead we've got these sitting in interactive flashcards. Now, just the act of forcing the student to move their cursor and click on these flashcards changes that experience completely. And you'll also notice these content blocks here as well. So what we're doing here is preventing the student from progressing to the next part of the content until they've engaged with all of the content. So for example, I can't click here and move on to the next section until I walk myself through the steps for administering an EpiPen. Okay, and you can see as I scroll through, not until I reach the final step will this turn into a clickable button. And then at the end, we also have a 3-minute video, which is embedded into the content. It's high quality, it's professionally done, and it's relevant to the content. And only then can I click continue and move on to the next section. So I think it's really important that we make sure that we break those programs down into achievable tasks, and that we have a system that will allow us to track student progress. We also recommend that you interrupt the content with formative assessments. So you could see on that example, we had activities embedded throughout that content, which force the learner to stop and think about what they've learnt, and then apply that newly learnt knowledge in the form of a formative assessment. So I'll just see if there's an example down here. So here's a sorting activity. So here we're actually forcing the learner to stop and think about where this information should be placed. And this is a perfect example of how we can create a small activity in an online piece of content that forces the person to stop, take a breath, and think about what they've just learned. Okay, so that's what we mean by interrupting the content. Another thing that we can do is we can also control the order and timing of learners' access to resources and assessments too. So what we can do in that example is we can say learners can't access assessment task 1 until they complete module 1. And so we actually control the way that, or the order in which they access those resources. We can also control the timing of access too. So in terms of being able to control a student's speed of progression, because again, we want to make sure that the student has enough time to absorb the information that they've learnt. What we can do is we can say, okay, well, you've got access to this module now, but you're not gaining access to module 2 until 3 weeks' time. And that gives you 3 weeks to digest this information. So a good learning management system will allow that functionality. So just to summarize that compliance, I think it's really important that when we build online content, that we think about that target cohort. We need to make sure that we've identified and we understand what type of person will be participating in an online course or one of our online programs. Once we establish that understanding of who that person is, then we can go about successfully developing and engaging online course and online content that forces the learner to stop and think about what they've learned, ensures that they don't rush through the content, and ensures that they are well supported through that process. So you can see here we've just got a couple of other points there too. So notifying ASQA is a really important one too. ASQA said they had over 1,000 providers notify them this year about a shift to online training, and you need to do that through ASQA.net if you are planning on changing or implementing online delivery. Need to also check the training package and make sure that, one, the training package allows for online learning, and some state training contracts will also have restrictions on what can be delivered online. And we need to make sure that if there are any practical components in our programs, whether that's delivery or assessment, that we have mechanisms in place to ensure that we meet those training package requirements. We want to go back and take a look at our technology and make sure that we understand what we're working with and whether or not we need to implement new technology into our business. And again, make sure that that training and assessment strategy is built with the cohort in mind. The entry requirements are documented and clearly articulated, and that we have those support mechanisms in place for an online environment. So that's it from me today. It was a very short webinar. Just wanted to give you guys a brief sort of overview of what the regulator's thinking, and get you thinking about how we can build engaging and successful content for online programs. So thank you once again to Accelerate for hosting this morning's session, and thank you to everyone who took the time to be a part of that. Wish you all the best, and good luck with all of those of you who are still in lockdown.